All right, we're doing this. When Jean Raspail's 1973 novel, The Camp of the Saints, is mentioned, it's usually to condemn it as a terribly racist depiction of third world migrants. Which, yeah, it's way over the top with its filthy mob led by a guy known only as the Turd Eater and the deformed monster child he carries around like a wretched little idol. But the thing with this book is that everyone is a caricature. It portrays an equally exaggerated and unflattering image of European leaders, the media, aid organizations, the church, the Soviets, right-wing rabble-rousers, and left-wing activists. The real target of its scorn isn't the third world horde. It's us, the people of the West. Raspail is calling us all bitches. Also, while I'm not going to get too much into how this is in many ways an alien invasion story, do keep War of the Worlds or District 9 in the back of your mind. Chapter 1 begins with a retired professor out on his terrace, watching the drama unfold through his telescope as a fleet of rusted, decrepit ships out of India grounds itself on the French coast. A fleet packed full of refugees, invaders, immigrants. It depends very much on one's perspective. His family has lived in that house since the 1600s with a massive oak door hand-carved by a direct ancestor to back up the claim. So practically everyone is a newcomer to him, some more welcome than others. He watches the locals flee in terror of the coming mob, watches the army desert rather than gun down filthy, starving people clamoring onto the beach. It's here where you'll find the most often quoted line from this book, delivered by an obnoxious hippie out looting and preaching the revolution. Your world doesn't mean a thing. They won't even try to understand it. They'll be tired, man, tired and cold, and they'll build a fire with your big wooden door, and they'll crap all over your terrace and wipe their hands on your shelves full of books. He's rather pleased about that, the fall of the world that the old professor represents. So Prof calmly goes inside for a shotgun and blasts that hippie off his porch. But we'll come back to him later. The whole drama began months before with an almost religious mass uprising in India. There, on the banks of the Ganges, the hungry mass of humanity found a figure to galvanize them. Way back, behind the backmost women in the crowd, a giant of a man stood stripped to the waist, holding something over his head and waving it like a flag. Untouchable pariah, this dealer in droppings, dung roller by trade, molder of manure briquettes, turd eater in time of famine, and holding high in his stinking hands a mass of human flesh. That mass is a severely deformed child that becomes a sort of guiding oracle to them. Referred to as a monster totem on several points, it shows them the way on their journey through gazes and shrieks. Nearly 1 million people gather and seize a collection of worn-out old ships, freighters, tugboats, anything that they can board and take control of. There's a steady glimmer of subtle supernatural influence throughout the story, whether the impression of a received vision, mentions of the unusually calm seas allowing the ships to make their journey, and of course overt religious references throughout. While a handful of Europeans on site, including the head of the Belgian consulate and Balan, referred to as an atheist philosopher, look on, the turd eater, proclaimed their mission like a prophet, telling a story of how Jesus was taken down off the cross by Buddha, Allah, and the whole Hindu pantheon, and the promise Christ made to honor the debt. And so, the turd eater continued, the nice little god off his cross rubbed the feeling back into his arms and legs, shook them, twisted his neck a few times in every direction, and said, "That's true. I owe you my life, and I'm going to give you my kingdom in return. Now the 1,000 years are ended. The nations are risen from the 4 corners of the earth, and their number is like the sand of the sea. They will march up over the broad earth and surround the camp of the saints in the beloved city." There was a pause. The monster's eyes grew dim. The turd eater suddenly seemed disturbed. He began to jerk and twitch. Incredible, Balan thought. Who would believe it? Apocalypse, chapter 20, 7 through 9. A few changes here and there, but plain enough. Now he's all shaken up, poor bastard. The rest just won't come. Or maybe he's trying to fight it back. Yes, that's it. Good for him. The monster's eyes lit up like a beacon, a sign that the pause was over. That's what the nice little god of the Christians told them. That line, the 1,000 years are ended, is picked up by sympathizers the world over. First as a slogan, Then a song is recorded and widely played, partly a marketing campaign to sell the idea of welcoming the poor downtrodden masses to Europe's shores, but spreading like what we might call a meme or a mind virus today. But at the beginning, standing there in the docks, Balan is one of the first to see an opportunity to use this to further his own ideological ends, bring the corrupt West to justice, and he helps them plan and prepare. But he can never really be one of them, discarded when he's no longer useful, and like so many, realizing too late. His end was quick. As he sank down into the murky water, he realized how much he loved and missed the West. And that last awareness, that utter rejection of all he had stood for, so pained and distressed him that he opened a willing mouth and took himself a healthy gulp of death. Trifle melodramatic, but clear enough. The packed ship set sail for the promised land in a ragtag fleet, like Battlestar Galactica, but reeking of excrement. Because that's how this book is. Its symbolism is not subtle. But the real point of it often gets lost because the whole third world shit goblin thing is so over the top it drowns out the rest of it. Prior to the fleet departing, the Belgian consul tried to contact government officials to do something about it. It's mostly ritual at that point. Some have gone into hiding and others just don't care. He finally manages to get the Minister for Information to answer the phone, at least, and he speaks of the doom coming to the West after a long reign of domination, contempt, and worst of all, symbolic gestures to help to soothe the Western conscience. That's where you went wrong. You should have held to your Western contempt. It might have steeled you against disaster, because that's what's brewing for you now, my friend, and you can't do a thing about it. When all is said and done, it will serve you right, and no one will stand up to fight it, not even your own. Which just goes to show what a decadent lot you really are. Most of the story is about reactions around the world as the fleet, dubbed the Last Chance Armada in the sympathetic press, makes its journey. Initially, the Armada was headed for the Suez Canal, but the Egyptians want no part of that. The mere thought of 1 million desperately impoverished refugees stuck in the Suez Canal through some sailing mishap, or perhaps through some move by the Western nations, was enough to strike terror in the ministers' hearts. So Egypt sends a torpedo boat out to persuade them to alter their course. They try hailing them, shouting messages. Finally, they fire a warning shot over the bridge of the lead ship, the India Star. This triggers the monster totem to let out a bellow, which was seen as a minor miracle and a sign by the gaggle crammed onto the ship. Or perhaps the shock of the shells detonating overhead jarred the little creature. Perhaps there's a clue to be found in this basic disparity in viewing the marvelous. Two opposing camps. One still believes, one doesn't. The one that still has faith will move mountains. That's the side that will win. Deadly doubt has destroyed all incentive in the other. That's the side that will lose. Following the sign as they see it, the fleet slowly turns south. Rather than the canal, they'll go around the Cape. The South African government, in a bid to gain some good press, sends food and medicine to the ships as they pass, which at this point have reached a very sorry state of hunger and filth. But the travelers toss it all overboard. The media tells stories ranging from a noble statement that they won't be bought off with handouts to accusing the South Africans of trying to poison them. There's a full-spectrum narrative campaign to push public opinion in favor of the Armada. Not a conspiracy of people at the top trying to destroy the country so much as just a deep inclination in the institutions. Part of it ideological and part of it self-reinforcing social pressures. It takes many forms, such as a seemingly open radio call-in show that carefully curates which viewpoints are aired. One caller, because he is of Indian descent, is put on the air, but when his opinion doesn't match expectations, he's quickly dropped when it becomes apparent that he doesn't fit the narrative they're pushing. But having gotten a few words in, they have to deconstruct and discredit him right there. You don't know my people, the squalor, the superstition, the fatalistic sloth they've wallowed in for generations. You don't know what you're in for if that fleet of brutes ever lands in your lap. Everything will change in this country of yours. My country now, too. They'll swallow you up. When Rosamond had recovered from the first moment of shock, she pressed the red button in front of her, the emergency switch that let them get rid of bothersome callers. Obviously not a typical case, Vilsberg cut in calmly. At any rate, Rosamond, I imagine the gentleman said all he had to say. What strikes me as strange is the fact that he's an Indian, but I'm sure there's a reason. Perhaps our sociologist friend would venture an opinion. The sociologist stopped to think. It was irrefutable. An acute sense of repeated frustration expressed in the rejection of one's own race. Caste prejudice, a common phenomenon in India. It wouldn't surprise me to learn that the gentleman's skin is quite light and that he belongs to the Brahmin aristocracy. All of that based solely on him saying things that didn't fit their preconceived idea of what he should say based on his ethnic background. He comes back later. In fact, he's key to everything this story is saying, as we will get to shortly. At this point, as the Armada draws closer, the public schools become propaganda machines, indoctrinating the young to the desired outlook through direct assignment and the soft thread of social stigma. 32,742 school teachers hit on the subject for the next day's theme. Describe the life of the poor, suffering souls on board the ships and express your feelings toward their plight in detail by imagining, for example, that one of the desperate families comes to your home and asks you to take them in. Irresistible, really, and the dear little angel, all simple, childish soul and tender heart, will spread 4 pages worth of infantile pathos, enough to melt a concierge to tears, and his paper will be the best. The teacher will read it in class, and all his little friends will kick themselves for having been much too stingy with their whines and whimpers. That's how we mold our men nowadays. It's certainly not limited to the little ones. The secondary schools are in on the game as well. At the very same instant, some 7,212 lycée professors decided to begin their next day's classes with a discussion of racism. It didn't make the slightest difference what they taught: math, English, chemistry, geography, even Latin. And of course, the newspapers are far from unbiased. The left-leaning papers are well-financed, and the most notable right-wing paper is only maintained as a straw man. If I decided to fold up today and stick the keys under your door, you'd buy up my paper on the sly and keep it running yourself, just to make sure you had something to sneer at. Wouldn't be the first time. To hold the line against fascism or some bullshit like that, you've got to be sure there are still a few good pseudo-fascists handy. When that paper finally has something to say and the resources to say it, thanks to the president, who hopes to use it to state the things he knows but is too constrained to say openly, they're throttled to only a few thousand copies. Enough to still be an opposition voice, but not enough circulation to make a difference. The printer goes on strike. "We're on strike," the foreman repeated. "I'm sorry, but you know our union rules." "Your union? That's a good one. Your union is downstairs in the boss's office, right?" "We're on strike," he echoed. "Period. That's it. Don't complain. You've got your 10,000 copies, same as always. What more do you want? And tomorrow? Tomorrow, same thing. Our local took a vote. We'll print you 10,000 copies, one more, and we go out on strike." They need opposition voices to exist, but they can't have too many people hearing them. There's no real debate happening. All the while, Western governments do nothing. Well, next to nothing. France sends a destroyer to confront the fleet. The crew refuse to fire on them. Later, the army drops their weapons and deserts. The landing is largely uncontested, and when the various minority and leftist factions within the country unite to overthrow the old regime, it just melts away, so hollowed out that there's nothing to hold it up. This, I think, is a misrepresentation at least as glaring as the turd eater and his gaggle of goblins. It presents the migrants as fouler than they are, and the West as weaker than it is, but consistent with the caricature nature of this story. Contrary to the book's depiction, I think there is still a vicious fight left in the West. The bulk of this video was recorded before the Nowak case was a major story, before the Belfast attack and subsequent riots, before Rupert Lowe's commission released their utterly damning report. The Saxon is learning to hate again, but a lot of folks don't understand the escalation curve at play here, so let's just jump right to that now. Part of that cultural tradition is a sense of restraint. Obviously, I'm not saying that the French, English, Germans, Americans never go apeshit and try to burn the house down. We've had our share of wars internally as well as with each other. But it's the baseline. There's an escalation. Let me put it this way. You've probably seen online some American right-winger respond to a news story about censorship or authoritarian measures in the UK or mainland Europe with a snide comment about, "That's why we have the Second Amendment," as they sit in front of their keyboard. Meanwhile, leftists are out throwing Molotovs at police stations and shooting pundits at presidents. From this, it's easy to conclude that the right are big talkers but no action. That's what's depicted in the camp of the saints. The right just doesn't have the drive or the stones to fight anymore. Only that misses that it isn't a flat line to oblivion, but a very gradual escalation curve that suddenly spikes upward when everything completely falls apart. Because the right generally feels invested in the system. It's one of the things that makes them right-wing. They don't want to cross outside of what is legal because they can't easily come back. The right, the conservative right, is restrained by attachment to the system even when they oppose what it's doing. Whereas the left, the revolutionary left in whatever form it takes, simultaneously isn't invested in the system, in fact wants to replace it, yet is actively protected by it not only through the presence of a functioning legal system itself, but ideologically aligned legal aid, friendly judges, academic cover, and police restraint through union pressure, fear of lawsuits, and bad PR. They tend to get a relatively soft hand these days, especially. This story riffs on that constantly. Generally speaking, the right doesn't want to cross the line into open violence because doing so means that they've already lost what they were trying to protect. It requires a much higher level of desperation to trigger an organized violent response from the right than the left. Put another way, left-wing protesters breaking windows and setting police cars on fire are sending the same message as right-wing protesters that stand outside Capitol buildings with unloaded rifles slung over their chests and meme patches on their plate carriers. Both are saying, "We don't like what you're doing and we can cause you pain if you don't back off." But the right is more symbolic because they still buy into the existing social order and its laws. So, where the camp of the saints gives a very insightful take on the political dynamics, I think it falls far short in terms of what the actual response to a breakdown of institutions like that portrayed in the story would look like. A related book, A Fugue for a Darkening Island, covers that element better. Set in Britain rather than France, with a massive influx from Africa rather than India, but the two books share many of the same themes, though in Fugue the military splits into factions, with a sizable chunk breaking off into a right-wing nationalist army. I might cover that book sometime if this one doesn't kill the channel. One of the most important passages in this story, from a conceptual standpoint, is spoken by Hamadura, that guy from the radio show, ethnically Indian but culturally French. He states something absolutely key to modern politics over race, immigration, and the whole idea of whiteness that gets bandied about these days. What I wanted to tell them, Hamadura continued, was that, to my way of thinking, being white isn't really a question of color. It's a whole mental outlook. We see this idea from the other side with recent talk about dismantling whiteness and white supremacy. White not simply as a collection of ethnic groups native to Europe, but as a cultural foundation, as Western civilization essentially. In part, that social cohesion that is often called high trust society, that general respect for people and their property, while it's certainly not been a universal and is generally in decline, it's been widespread enough in the West that it was considered normal. The high trust society is one of the core social technologies of Western civilization. It's also a prerequisite for democratic government that isn't just big group dominance. There's also the coded Marxist language usage, with white in the Bolshevik sense as opposed to red, white-collar, clean, non-laboring as the capitalists and their running dogs, versus the non-white proletariat, obfuscated class struggle language. Karlin Borisenko gets into this in great detail, but it's a separate thing from what Raspail is talking about here. Traditionally, one of the great strengths of the West has been its ability to absorb people from other civilizations. Turn them white, so to speak, in keeping with this concept of white as a mental outlook. People from anywhere could become Roman or French or American by adopting the culture over the course of a generation or two. Being part of those cultures and societies was not a fundamentally ethnic distinction. Attacks on whiteness, then, are attacks on this Western idea of culture over blood. And that's ultimately what this story is about. Less the elimination of the white race than the destruction of that cultural foundation that serves as the scaffolding for democracy, for industrial civilization, advanced science, and progressive politics, including that strain of progressivism that's fixated on destroying the foundation that makes its own existence possible. Raspail's point with the Camp of the Saints wasn't to predict a specific scenario, but to illustrate trends, to warn. He plainly states as much on the first page of the book. I wanted to write a lengthy preface to explain my position and show that this is no wild-eyed dream, that even if the specific action, symbolic as it is, may seem far-fetched, the fact remains that we are inevitably heading for something of the sort. We need only glance at the awesome population figures predicted for the year 2000, i.e. 28 years from now. 7 billion people, only 900 million of whom will be white. But what good would it do? You are probably having the same reaction as most people that casually pick up the book, assuming that that bit about how many will be white is referring purely to race. But if we look at it in terms of what the Hamadura character explains most clearly, though it shows up at a few other points in this book, it says something quite different. The two things coexist in this story: cultural whiteness and ethnic whiteness, just so that we can distinguish here. Two distinct and separate concepts. Hamadura is explicitly speaking of the cultural civilizational aspect. Many of the new regime mean it in explicitly ethnic terms. For example, the Paris multiracial commune, a collection of communists, race-baiting loudmouths, and immigrant activists, styling themselves as the new government, are united by their fixation on destroying the native French. In one instance, a self-loathing Frenchwoman is speaking of her campaign to breed out the native population. Only a white woman can have a white baby. Let her choose not to conceive one. Let her choose only non-white mates, and the genetic results aren't long in coming. In the first provisional government, by the way, Elise was named Minister of Population. Now, this is the point where this book gets really dicey. One of the questions this story implies, without directly asking, is how intertwined are culture and ethnicity? It directly acknowledges that ethnically non-white people can be culturally white, which, seriously, is one of the most inclusive ideas that you can express. You of different background can join our tribe and become part of our society, not just live among us, but really become one of us. The Camp of the Saints is not the Turner Diaries, and it's not some screed proclaiming an inherent genetic superiority of European peoples. But it also, when taken all together, implies that white culture is impossible without a critical mass of ethnically white people. Is that really the case? Setting aside whatever our particular ideological alignments demand we say, we honestly don't know. The example of Japan suggests yes. They have an orderly, prosperous society, that high trust thing again. The Japanese might be whiter than we are in that cultural sense. How much of that is due to cultural exchange is open for vehement argument, but they have a good thing going there and absolutely rank high in the functional society scale. On the other hand, the entire experience of post-colonialism suggests no. The British, the French, the Dutch left, and things just ran down. There comes a point when it can't all be blamed on a history of exploitation and racism, and we're well past that point. And it's not just a question of how big the cities are or how bright the skyline shines at night. China has built some damn impressive cities and a massive economy over the last few decades. Unquestionably one of the great civilizations, both today and historically. But at least today, it's a low-trust society. I'm reminded of a conversation from many, many years ago with one of my economics professors, originally from China, about doing business there. Basically, that in the West, we start with the assumption that the other party is legit and operating in good faith, and we lose trust if they lie, if they just seem shifty, or they fail to deliver as promised. In China, it works the other way. Trust has to be built up from nothing. And since both parties expect the other to cheat them in some way, both are looking for ways to cut corners. My own very limited experience working with Chinese manufacturers tracks to this, but I welcome counterpoints from people with more experience dealing with that culture. Whatever the case, a low trust baseline radically affects every level of social and economic interactions. It's not just about convenience or business deals. It's the foundation of how people interact with each other. Do you help a stranger change a flat tire? Do you spot a coworker for lunch if they've lost their wallet? Can you have something delivered to your house and not have it stolen by porch pirates? What do you assume about the people that you encounter throughout the day? What do you assume they assume about you? The story talks some about the new regime, built on a brotherhood of mankind, the end of racism, achieved by subjugating the whites. But it's also a story about rapidly transitioning to a low-trust society. Corruption and decay follows. We might point out that cars are still coming off the lines at the Javel plant, though they're awfully expensive and terribly scarce. They're reserved first choice for the officials of the new regime. To buy one himself, a worker in one of these people-run plants would have to pay 10 times what he makes in a year, a pleasure he can ill afford. He can take consolation, however, in using our public conveyances, chaotic and decrepit, or in joining the rest of the ill-shod pedestrians thronging the streets. Incidentally, it seems likely that a high-trust society is a necessary precondition for a non-racist society. Otherwise, race is just another in the long list of reasons to assume the worst of strangers. Anyone who honestly thinks of themselves as anti-racist should be among the staunchest defenders of white culture, if for no other reason that no one else cares about not being racist. There's another thread in this story that stands out to me. While most of the army deserts, not all of them do. A handful of men under the command of Colonel Constantine Dragasse, who still has some fight in him even while recognizing that it won't be nearly enough. He and his small force secure a hillside village, which they come to call the village, and which happens to be the home of the professor we met in the first chapter. He's been watching their exploits as they make their way into town and has a feast prepared for them when they arrive. After disposing of the dead hippie, of course. They're eventually joined by a former minister of the French government, among several others. A little mini France up there. They even give each other official titles. Minister of Defense, the professor is Minister of Culture, all amidst much laughter at my butchering of the French names. I have a great idea, Perrette broke in. We already have all the ministries we need, a commander-in-chief, a loyal army, a first-rate mayor, but we don't have the most important thing of all, the people. Damn it, you're right, exclaimed the colonel. Shame on me, how could I forget? All right. Creon, Romegas, you be the people, how's that? They gave each other a nudge, and Creon answered, I guess the two of us can handle it all right. Just one thing. Can we strike when we want to? Strike already? And picket and carry signs, Romegas added. I mean, we've got to know, are we the people or aren't we? The right to strike is a sacred institution, like the rule of law. Perrette declaimed, properly pontifical, as if he were delivering a speech in the chamber. Both of them are sacred to our Western way of life. I give you my solemn assurance that the government is perfectly prepared to negotiate, within reasonable limits, of course, and with all due consideration for the welfare of the state. It goes without saying that you'll have to form a union, or better still, two rival unions, since there are two of you. You'll simply have to picket at different times and places. The mayor will take care of all the details. They all know they're doomed, but they are not going to go out moping. There's much to laugh at in the dying days of the West, after all. So much of it looks rather silly in the face of annihilation. Meanwhile, in Paris, little committees are popping up to build a new world. They take it all very seriously, despite lacking any serious ability. They argue, make grand but vague announcements, give themselves jobs without any of the mirth of the crew back in the village. Before very long, a junta had emerged. A triumvirate consisting of a black street sweeper, obviously inspired, a young Vietnamese at school in Paris, and a radical student power type, probably French. Then they took another vote. First a name, a distinctive symbol, the PPRC, or the Paris People's Radio Cooperative, ready to serve the provisional government of the Paris multiracial commune, adopted again by a show of hands. Reading this made me think of the Chaz in Seattle, specifically that map showing their borders, where the porta potties were, and the regime-occupied Safeway down the street. The right and left are often equally absurd, but Raspail writes the left is just no fun. Which has often been my own experience as well. I mean, not 100% obviously, but leftists are far more likely to get triggered by a joke. They seem to have a much harder time just talking over a beer with someone they don't agree with. Everything is political. Half of my rejection of the modern left is just not wanting to be around humorless, unpleasant people. The true right is never so grim. That's why the left hates its guts, the way a hangman must hate the victim who laughs and jokes on his way to the gallows. But of course the village is only a brief little glimmer before the end. Once the new regime gets its shit together enough to get a few planes in the air, they bomb the place. France falls, the rest of Europe follows, and so ends the white folks, at least in cultural terms, and all the progress and goodies that come with it. The process involves organized sexual violence. Raspail doesn't get graphic with it, but it's plainly stated several times. That's always been part of war, of one group taking territory from another. This instance is no different, though. It takes a more systematized form. The enterprise was even given a name: the White Female Practice and Experimentation Center. White women soon lost all pride in their color, and with it all resistance. This is relevant today, with sexual assaults by migrants, often in groups, having become so prevalent in European countries. It's not racism or xenophobia, it's just crime stats. In that context, and in many of these cases, it's not simply a criminal act, a perpetrator and a victim. It's an assertion of group dominance, a claim of territory, an act of war, one tribe against another. That needs to be kept in mind when looking at these incidents. Overall, the Camp of the Saints is an unflattering portrayal of everyone it turns an eye toward, but it's mostly an indictment of the irrational self-loathing that was really taking hold in the Western world at the time and has just festered since. It's a rather blunt, sometimes cartoonish portrayal of a serious theme: the fear that the West has lost its mojo. The book is directly attacking that idea that having pride in the accomplishments of the West, of whiteness in that cultural sense, is a bad thing. A bit less bluntly, it takes on the lunacy of the whole movement that professes to be for alleviating poverty, fighting racism, giving the people a voice, and then directs all its attacks on the civilization that has done far more in service of those ideas than any other. And it warns that we must temper compassion with a hard edge of realism, something that many of Raspail's characters have entirely lost. It assumes that if the West falls, the entire world suffers. And if history and the state of the world is any indication, it's not wrong. As I've already said, I think it goes too far in its depiction of weakness. Even the Soviet army is portrayed as hollowed out and lacking the capacity for direct action when pushed. Well, all we can do now is figure out how much vodka we'll need to make these Chinese look as if they all have uniforms. Then we can shoot them without a second thought. It turns out there's not enough vodka in all of Mother Russia. They fold in the face of a few million Chinese peasants. Sure. Realistically, there will always be people willing to slaughter other people in job lots, regardless of how pitifully they present themselves. The more of them there are, the closer to home they get, the more willing people will be to look at them, pull the trigger, and watch the other die so that their kin can live. And accept the lifetime of nightmares that follows as the price for being able to watch their kids grow up. When my colleagues decide to discuss the subject rationally, I'll be only too happy to suggest 20 serious ways of solving this ludicrous problem. For example, the president queried. The undersecretary sat up straight, pointed his hands like a child with a make-believe gun, swept them in an arc around the table. Bang, 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 you're all dead. That, I think, is the real danger we're facing. The West won't go quietly. There's a point where a rageful awakening of such brutality will happen that, whether it's too late or reverses the course, who can say, only that it would be better for everyone that it not get to that point. First, no country has to let anyone in. It would be perfectly within their sovereign rights for any nation, whether France or China or Eritrea, to say, piss off. If you weren't born here, you can't live here. Just as it's reasonable to be selective about who is let in. Diversity is not our strength. Our strength is in coming together around the things we have in common. Western cultures have gotten rather good at finding those things, of integrating immigrants into the wider culture and value system. But with some people, there just isn't enough to build on. Charity comes with a cost, and it has to be balanced. Of course, you can argue that there is a moral duty to help, to provide an opportunity for a better life. But if you take that tack, none of the arguments for large-scale immigration from the third world, fleeing from war, religious persecution, economic opportunity, lack of infrastructure, healthcare, education in their home countries, all of these could be addressed more effectively, more extensively, and more long-lasting, and with fewer downsides in the home countries, with some form of recolonization. Make the places they're running from like the places that they're running to. Save them the trip. Yet the activists go into a tizzy if you say so. I don't think it would be a good idea. It wouldn't be worth the blood and treasure, and I want no part of it. But it would do everything that the migrants' welcome crowd claims to stand for, and do it better, revealing some insincerity or at least severe naivety in their stated reasons. On a closing note, I'll say that while this is a European story written about people losing their native land, I'm looking at it as an American, part of a nation that conquered someone else's land and made it ours. It's a reminder that if you can't hold your homeland, whether through simple material inability or cultural weakness, sooner or later somebody will take it from you. It's the same idea at the core of science fiction stories about alien invasions, told in many iterations from different angles, but with one common element. Something utterly foreign arrives to challenge us for what we thought was ours. The camp of the saints, while not looking as far as distant planets for its aliens, is working with the same core ideas. It even dabbles in the same kind of language at some points, such as when the deformed children swarm the beach ahead of the others still in the ships. They looked like an army of little green men from some remote planet. Behind them, the bulk of the mob marked time. Up on the bridge stood the dwarf, cap on head, staring blankly at the beach as if waiting for a message from his hideous cohorts. Some kind of report telepathically transmitted. And the monsters snuffled and sniffed at the sand, mouthed it by the handful, struck it with their fists to make sure it was real, and, convinced that it was, sprang somersaults over their horrid twisted limbs. Yes, the country would suit them fine. It could almost be a passage from the War of the Worlds. And I say this as, metaphorically, a descendant of the Martian invaders. The American Indians were faced with a likely insurmountable gap of technology, organizational capacity, and disease factors. The tide was against them from the moment the first ships arrived, but they didn't yield easily. If the West should fall, it will be entirely our own damn fault. Maybe it's time we both acknowledge our sins and took pride in our achievements, found our civilization on balance good, and took steps to make sure it stands for another 1,000 years. Otherwise, everyone will almost certainly be worse off for it. Whatever the case, the camp of the saints is often represented as just a xenophobic screed, but underneath it's an insightful and often prescient dissection of trends within Western society. Trends we would do well to correct regardless of political alignment. It's a lot harder to rebuild a civilization like ours than it is to properly maintain it. Learned a lot of good stuff from Father Shen. It was a Jesuit school. I'm sure that bit of feral lore will lead to some speculation, but I was never read into any grand plots or conspiracies.